let me ask, because I'm always interested, where is this one doing most of its observations? What areas? Let me ask you that.
You're talking about geographic?
No, of topics.
Oh, okay. The way it works is that as the data rolls on in, we it's kind of like a pig that's been swallowed by a python, right? We know the pig's inside the python, and we have to start at the tail, and we just start squeezing on the python until we come into something that isn't python. And what we're actually doing is we're hunting for what we call our immediacy values. So as we start gathering lots of data, millions of reads, we want to see kind of like what's up on the very leading edge of the curve that's heading our way. So we're trying to find the pig's snout inside the python through these immediacy values. So that's really what part one is about, is a very short-term look. For instance, this past year when we did the run prior to the Olympics, we were able to pick up on some accidents and stuff that manifested like 4 or 5 days later, if I'm not mistaken. So that's an idea of an immediacy value. It has a close-in impact, very high emotional hit level, but not necessarily much in the way of a carry value. In other words, you won't necessarily be discussing it a month from now.
So when you start one of the runs, you don't actually have a specific area that you are looking to get information on. You basically open it up and then see what the subconscious mind of the world offers back to you.
In a real sense, but within a little bit of a structured framework, correct. Because what we do is we open it up, but we know, for instance, because we've done this work in the past, that we'll always find a whole lot of emotional descriptors, we call them, that hover around the idea of Earth changes, abnormal weather, etc. We also know that we'll find a whole lot that hover around political kind of things and a whole lot that hover around economic. So we know in advance the general sense of the entities that we're going to be dealing with, but not necessarily any specifics or what direction they're likely to head. Okay.
So, in essence then, at this early stage, you don't really know where you're going with it. Is that right?
Correct. We won't know what the net result will be until really the end of 4 or 5. That gives us our longest look out. We could process the longer term, what we call intermediate and short-term impact, which is like a month to 3 months out. We could process that now, but we've only got 12, 15 million reads under our belt, and you don't get that many of those kind of values within that number of reads. We can always skim off immediacy values because everybody's always chattering about the events of the day, and there's a certain amount of emotion that's frothing in that. It's kind of like always being able to take cream off the milk. But you don't know what the butterfat content's going to be down in the milk until you really get into it. And so for us, we want to have a big lot of butterfat content to squeeze our longer-term values out of. So we need 35, 40 million reads under our belt before we can go through and process for the short, near-term and longer-term values.
And
that sort of makes sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. And that's 4 runs, you said?
Well, the data run is what we call a run is from the time we start gathering data until the end of the last report. Now, the data gathering might extend 30, 35, 40 days, and we'll start doing the report a week or 9 days into it. And the whole process takes like perhaps maybe 8 weeks or so. You usually get about 6 reports out of a data run that'll bring back somewhere in the region of 60 to 70 million reads. Okay. Yeah, what I meant was, Cliff, each section, if that's the proper term, as you write your preliminary reports, lasts about a week. Is that right? Correct.
Okay, yeah. Now, in that, you begin to formulate fairly fast what direction each of these different, the total run is going to be taking you.
Correct.
That's got to be exciting. I mean, in other words, you're stepping in blind, and and you have no idea. And yet, isn't it interesting that in every case that I'm aware of, and I'm sure it's not every, but at least the ones I'm aware of, what starts to come out at this 8-week, 6-week, 4-week and less as the time approaches really is right on target with what is happening in the world and the nation at that time.
At some level, that's correct. I mean, I really hate to say it's really right on target, but for instance, we got, in terms of accuracy, we had many descriptors that actually described what people would be seeing on all of the network news stations in the sense of roads littered with people and debris, small injuries, limping around, tending to each other, small tribes forming, all of the human relationship stuff that we saw occur.
Right.
But we didn't have a date, we didn't have a time, we didn't even really, to a certain extent, have a cause. We knew that the city would be going back into the mud the way that our descriptors described it, and then they went on to some length describing all these poor people trying to live on the overpasses, basically. Wow. So we were accurate that way. Yeah. So to a certain extent, it's true. We end up certainly getting the main flavor of it all, and a whole bunch of the words we usually see blasted out to us by the media.
One of the things that I happen to see on your new, and I'm always hesitant to say prognostication, whatever you want to call it, but whatever you foresee coming up in the future, the thing that really caught my eye was 20 more days of this kind of stuff in the month of September.
From the viewpoint of the Bushista entity, that is certainly the case, yes.
Can you elaborate a little more on that and tell us exactly what we might be in for?
Well, now we have to be real careful here because Bushista is not necessarily we. All right, we have to separate ourselves from the government and its elected titular idiots here. Bushista entity started off a number of years ago in like 99, I believe, when we first started picking it up as a combination of a bunch of entities that it eventually became a thing we called Bushco because it was very heavily tainted with corporate, dominated by it, as a matter of fact.
Interesting, yeah.
And in turn used that as a tool in a general sense. We saw much to indicate that the corporate nature was being used by the Bushco entity to influence things. And then later on, curiously, we started seeing the corporate language separate from the political language about before Saddam was captured, somewhere around in there, November-ish. Yeah. And at that point, we renamed the entity because the corporate was clearly moving off on its own. And then later, curiously, several months later, we started seeing the defection of the corporate people from the Bushco ranks. And now what we have is the Bushista entity, because it's even dropped the press. At one point, it totally dominated the press. Sure. Any language you saw coming out of the White House was repeated ad nauseum from all of the major mouthpieces.
That's right.
And then we saw that started to separate. So we ended up with this thing we called Bushista, which represents the Bush administration, the main players within it, and those people who are inclined to bow down and kiss posteriors. And this entity has got 20 really bad days ahead of it, or in total in the first part of the month here. It's hard for us to say because our granularity isn't precise. It's not like in astrology where you can say on this particular time, down to the millisecond, this kind of a conjunction will occur. For us, what we get is a granularity that, at best, we're always a day or so off. Sometimes we're 5 or 6 weeks off, but usually our timing on the short-term stuff is a little bit better. So for here, we see that not only do they have the whole chaos emerging from the major snafu in dealing with the largest natural disaster ever to hit the United States, but we've got all kinds of stuff showing up. We have to stop and go back for a second and say that in August 12th or 14th, our data showed we went through what we called a metadata transition. And one might think of this as like the theme that's going to permeate public life and press reports for a while. Sort of like in World War II, that was the theme. Everybody is patriotic, etc. Cold War, McCarthyism, they all had their flavors and they all lasted for a while. And we're in another one of these flavors that we're calling militancy. And militancy is perhaps a bit misleading because we could also term it aggression. There's a whole lot of words that can be used nearly identically in certain circumstances, and so when we get words back, we don't necessarily get a precise word. We might get a list of 30 words or 20,000 words that all revolve around a certain emotional concept.
Wow.
But at the moment, the Bush guys, or all the Bushista entity, is working through this whole militancy issue. Against that backdrop, we've got a slightly one layer down, this other thing that there's also a metadata aspect that we're calling secrets revealed. So against those two, every move that you see over the next 20 days will be played against a backdrop of militancy, and as its consequence, will reveal more and more secrets, none of which is good for the Bushista entity.
Okay, so the 20 days within the next month is not necessarily a negative time for the rest of us, but it's a negative time for the Bush et al.
Correct.
Okay,
Now, it is true that we have this layer